right. I posted the grades, and what I'll do at the end of class, I'll give back the exams. And it was kind of variable. Some people did a lot better. Some people did more poorly. So I think I'd say if you're having any trouble, I'm going to try to reach out to you that are, and I don't know if Ariel, is she here? We have an undergraduate tutor that might be able to help if you need any additional help, and I can help you too. So. And again, as we mentioned, if you do poorly on one exam, you can take the final. The final won't be entirely comprehensive. It'll be about probably half of the topics from each section. I'll tell you what they are. So you can substitute your final grade for your lowest kind of regular exam. So you do have some options if you're not doing too well. And again, depending on how you're doing in lab and the homework and the attendance, sometimes that can boost your grade too. So. Again, if you have any concerns, please reach out to me, and I'm happy to try to help you myself or get you help and those sorts of things. So we'll do that. So what we'll do today is I decided not to do a video lecture, and we'll just kind of finish this one up. And then you're doing optimal foraging this week in lab, and so you're going to have some lizards, and you're going to give them choices among 3 different kinds of prey that they can eat, and you're going to determine, what the mass is of each of these prey, and assuming the mass is some relationship to how much energy they have, do those lizards eat what we call the most profitable prey. So I'm going to give you some equations and things like that, and what I'll do about probably towards the end, I'm going to give you a little problem that is based on this equation that's used to determine whether a predator should only eat the most profitable prey or should it eat 2 prey in its diet. So it's kind of, we'll be looking at whether predators should specialize on something or should they have a more generalized diet. So, and you'll be doing that in lab this week. So, okay. So what we're going to talk about today is our adaptations to the physical environment, and we're going to be looking kind of at light, energy, and heat, and this is really fast, and I'm not going to get into all the physical basis of a lot of this stuff, but obviously, okay, maybe if it works. Why is light, heat, and energy so important, do you think? And look at those organisms right there. What kind of environments are these organisms living in? It's kind of hard to tell what the bottom one is, but, well, that's a camel, right? That's a pretty arid, hot environment, isn't it, right? So one of the issues that organisms in the bottom there is you can't necessarily see it, but that's a desert kangaroo rat. So a lot of times what we're going to look at is how do organisms cope with these sort of extreme environments in terms of heat and availability of water, and what sort of adaptations do they have to sort of minimize heat gain or water loss and these sorts of things, and what are the kind of unique adaptations they have. The framework, this is pretty simple, and we all believe that global warming is a process. I'm going to show you that it's pretty incontrovertible in most scientists' opinion, right, that global temperatures are going up. The mechanism is fairly well understood. There's still a lot of controversy in terms of which organisms can adapt to global warming. Some may do better than others, and this is, I think, what we're mostly concerned about. But obviously, this is very important. As global temperatures increase, organisms are going to be facing higher temperatures, and if you look at what's happening in the Arctic right now, what happened this year in the Arctic? So ice melt was the highest recorded ice melt ever. So, and the temperatures were extremely high in the Arctic this winter. So again, what we're looking at, we're going to be talking about extreme events and those sorts of things, and how those might characterize ongoing climate change. Okay. So here this is kind of just a diagram of the various sorts of things that, for example, a plant, this is a desert plant, that a desert plant might face. And in terms of, obviously, there are lots of sources of heat, there are lots of sources of, light and all those sorts of things, and how do organisms deal with that in this particular? So here's a plant. There are lots of things we can look at, right? Here's direct sunlight from the sun hitting the leaf. That's what we call direct sunlight. That's obviously important for a lot of things, right, in terms of photosynthesis. But also the other thing there is also sunlight can hit the ground. It can be reflected and also be absorbed by the plant material. So that's another way that it can happen. You can also have sunlight that is reflected off clouds and then hits the ground or hits the leaf. So there are lots of sources of sunlight, from scattered sunlight, reflected sunlight, and direct sunlight that the plant can use for photosynthesis, okay? There's a lot of other things that obviously go on too, right? As a plant gets sunlight, it potentially, what happens to leaves depending on when that sunlight hits them? Not only do they use it for photosynthesis, but what's another issue a plant potentially has to deal with in terms of the leaf material? Huh? Yeah, so it can potentially heat up, right? Especially leaves that are very thin. If you're in a hot environment, right, a lot of times what's going to happen is a lot of things are going to happen, but one of the most important things is what's called transpirational heat loss. And basically that's water coming out of pores, you know, called the stomata, right? Where that heat is going to be can be lost from that plant. The problem with that often is when that heat is dissipated or lost, right, because it's overheating, guess what else goes out with it? Water, okay? So a lot of times when things in a desert, a plant starts heating up, right, its leaves start heating up, it can dissipate or transpire a lot of that heat by opening up its stomata, but the problem is in a dry environment, you also then have problems because you're going to lose water. So a lot of times that balance between those two things is important. Okay. So there are lots of other things. Lots of different kinds of thermal radiation can occur. We're not going to worry too much about this. This is not sunlight, but heat, right, that comes from, you know, the soil heats up. That heat rises, it can hit the leaf tissue and also contribute to the plant leaves getting warmer. And so there are lots of sources of energy that can cause leaf temperature to increase pretty dramatically, especially in extreme environments. Okay. The other thing that can happen, of course, is as deserts are often fairly windy places, what do you think happens when wind goes across some material property, especially a living organism? What happens? Yeah, as it goes across that leaf tissue, what's it going to do to heat? This is what's called convection, right? So as that air goes over that leaf, it's actually going to convect heat away from the plant. So obviously, when it's windier, right, versus still air, when do you feel more comfortable in terms of your body temperature? When it's windier, right? Because you're dissipating heat. You're convecting heat away from a warmer body. It depends on the air temperature. But if the air temperature is cooler than you are, right, then it's going to dissipate heat away from you and you're going to feel cooler. Whereas if it's a completely calm day, the same air temperature, right, same humidity, you're going to feel a lot warmer. Okay. So there are lots of physical properties that influence sort of convection and the movement of heat away from also that plant tissue. So anyway, here's just kind of so there are a bunch of different things that, anyway, we're not going to talk, I guess we talked about most of those. So there are a bunch of adaptations that desert plants have, these things that live in, you know, hot environments. There are lots of sort of adaptations. So mesquite is a very common plant in the southwestern deserts. So these leaflets are subdivided into leaflets, right? So it's not one continuous leaf, right? You've got all these little subleaflets, right? And it turns out that's actually a really easy way to dissipate heat. You have much more surface area, so you can dissipate, that facilitates the dissipation of heat, okay? So rather than one continuous leaf, they're all subdivided into these leaflets. And you see that a lot in desert plants. That's one way to kind of dissipate heat when it's really hot, okay? Obviously, one of the things where do you think you lose more water, though, in that case? In these kinds of leaves. So you have to, we're not going to worry too much about this. Another thing that a lot of things do is this Palo Verde, these leaflets they basically have tiny and thick stems. It turns out a lot of these stems have chlorophyll in them. So they actually do a lot of their photosynthesis not in leaves, but in stems and that sort of thing. And this is fairly common too. Okay. And here's an example. Does it ever rain in the desert? Yeah, there's certain periods in the spring, depending on time of year, where it rains a lot, and what a lot of plants do is they produce these sort of broad, thick, kind of succulent leaves only during that time. That's when water's highly available, so they only produce these broad, succulent leaves for a few weeks during the summer or rainy season, and then often they drop them, and they don't do a lot of photosynthesis, or they produce different kinds of leaves that don't have to worry about losing too much water. Okay. So there are lots of adaptations that organisms have. So those were plants. When you think about a lot of vertebrates, right? We can lose heat too, right? When you get cold, where do you put your where do you lose heat? In your extremities, right? And where do you put everything to cover yourself? You wear gloves, you wear a stocking cap, or you wear thick boots, right? So obviously extremities, thermal heat loss, this is actually an infrared camera of snow geese up in the Arctic during probably a very cold spell. And guess where they're losing heat? Yeah. So the whitish colors represent higher heat levels. And so it's basically in the head and the feet, and the core body temperature has less heat loss. And of course, what do they have there? They have a lot of feathers, all sorts of things, fat tissue, all those sorts of things that minimize the heat loss. But obviously, they can lose a lot of heat during cold times in extremities. Okay. So when you think about birds or mammals, and you compare that to like reptiles or snakes, what's different about those two kinds of organisms in terms of heat balance or heat retention or fluctuations of body temperature with air or ambient temperature? Yeah, so we're endotherms, right? So we can sort of maintain a consistent core body temperature, right? 98.6 if you're not sick in general, right? Is that true for lizards and snakes or insects? No, they're ectotherms. So a lot of their body temperatures fluctuate with ambient or air temperature. And so they have to deal with a lot more sort of heat loss. And these are two different strategies. We're not going to go into all the advantages and disadvantages of each one of those things, but when you think about it, ectotherms in general, their body temperatures often can fluctuate depending on the ambient temperature. Their caloric demands or their food intake, is it as urgent or as necessary as it is for us to maintain? They don't have to worry about maintaining body temperature, taking in a lot of calories and those sorts of things. So they opt for this strategy that's kind of, it's a low cost thing, right? They don't have to eat as much. They can spend a lot of periods of time without, a lot of eating. And they don't have huge metabolic demands like we do to maintain our core body temperature. And those are strategies that probably work in different kinds of environments or different situations. Okay. So obviously so what can organisms like this do to minimize heat loss during these sort of extreme cold events? Can you think of like any behavioral strategies that, Yeah, obviously one of the biggest things in organisms that live in northern Canada, northern Sweden, Russia, all those things, right? And they're, endotherms, birds, and all these sorts of things. A lot of what they do is they have to eat a lot during the daytime. It's not very long, right? So they don't have a lot of time to eat, but then they often spend a lot of time roosting together as groups, like in cavities of, these don't live in cavities of trees, but a lot of what some birds, small birds, do in these environments is they get into holes in trees, and they're often 5 to 15 of them all huddled together. They're out of the wind during the night, and they're all sort of dissipating their loss. They're minimizing their heat loss because they're all coming together, right? And so you guys obviously may do the same thing. You may snuggle when it's cold, and that minimizes heat loss, okay? So there are lots of different strategies we can use, okay? And we think that we're probably in the midst of experiencing more extreme temperatures, right? And there's clear evidence that this is occurring. And so global warming is going to lead to increased ambient temperatures both in terrestrial environments and marine environments. And the marine environments seem to be escalating at a much higher rate than we originally anticipated. And so organisms are going to have to respond to these sort of rising temperatures, and and obviously I think a lot of organisms can adapt their physiological adaptations to deal with these sorts of things. Some may not do too well. So these are some of the controversies that people are worried about and thinking about. So when we think about the greenhouse effect, and we'll be spending a lot more time looking at this later in the semester when we start looking at sort of carbon cycles and those sorts of things in much greater detail. So when we look at the greenhouse effect, it's basically the absorption of infrared radiation by certain kinds of greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide is believed to be the most important one that's increasing global temperatures. Do you know of any others that are believed to be important gases that are increasing, that are also contributing to global warming besides carbon dioxide? Huh? Yeah, methane is another one, okay? And methane, lots of sources of that are cows, but there are also lots of sources of methane from deep sea thermal vents that escape and lots of things. Now, I don't think that's escalating. It may be escalating under global warming, so that's one thing that people are wondering about is, are methane levels going to continue to increase due to global warming? And then, yeah.
There was just an article in the news about how in some of the Arctic ice caps, we were starting to see methane bubbling.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's starting to
Yeah, yeah. So the question is, there are lots of reservoirs of methane, right, from deep sea thermal vents. I actually didn't know that, so I wonder where it is is it in the ice caps? Is it actually trapped in the ice caps? Is that what they said? Okay. Yeah. 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 So that's going to bubble up and that's going to increase, and it's going to go into the atmosphere. So I'm not going to go into all the physical properties, but this is pretty well short. So short wavelength light, sun passes through the atmosphere. A lot of it is absorbed in light. Absorbed light, warms the surface. But then there's a lot of the warm surface emits sort of infrared radiation. And that infrared radiation moves upward towards the atmosphere, and increasing levels of carbon dioxide and other kinds of greenhouse gases, as those go up, they're going to absorb more of it and convert it to heat. And we believe that's the direct link to rising global temperatures, okay? That the increasing amount of CO2 and other greenhouse gases is absorbing this infrared radiation. It's not going up through the atmosphere and dissipating out. It's being trapped, and that's why we're starting to see these increasing global temperatures. Okay. And again, there is a lot of people, that's a very broad description of what's going on. There are lots of people who are very interested in how all these various things change depending on where you are, what parts of the atmosphere, how polar jet streams influence all these sorts of things. So I presented this as really simple. It's a lot more complicated than I fully understand. I'm not an atmospheric scientist, but there's a fair amount of controversy about the details, the impacts, and all those sorts of things. There's not much controversy about carbon dioxide playing a very important, the primary role in global warming. So its impacts and where it's having its greatest impact is still somewhat controversial, but that sort of thing. Okay. And which organisms, which ecosystems will be most vulnerable to global warming? Obviously, people are concerned. People are very concerned about the Australian barrier reef, right? There's an incredible amount of bleaching going on there, presumably due to primarily increasing water temperatures, and people are, I don't know, it's concerning. Okay, so what kind of data do we use to say that, in fact, carbon dioxide levels are increasing? We have all sorts of ways to do this, and CO2 concentration. This is primarily done through basically ice cores. That you can go down and measure various kinds of isotopes of carbon dioxide that are very closely related, probably, to CO2 concentrations. Okay, so here is, for example, a 250,000 year profile of some area. I don't know where the ice plugs were taken from, but CO2 concentrations. And what do you see there? Looks variable, doesn't it? So again, CO2 concentrations vary a lot over this time scale and even over short time scales. And so a lot of it is trying to figure out, disentangling noise from sort of reality, right? So it's kind of trying to separate out noise from the real signal that we're seeing, okay? And so as we look at it here, you can see there seem to be a lot of fluctuations, right? So you have fairly high levels, here's a fairly high level here, about 110,000 years ago. What was that associated with? And I didn't read the article, so I can just make it up, right? I think it's associated with Ice Age. I suspect it was primarily associated with periods, after a high glacial event, so during a warming period, but I may be wrong. I don't remember the exact thing. But anyway, you do see peaks, right? You see high levels, of carbon dioxide 110,000 years ago. That had nothing to do with us, did it? Nope, that ain't us, okay? It probably had something to do with these periodic climatic oscillations, right, where we've gone through a period of Pleistocene glacial periods, right, interspersed by warming periods, and some pretty extreme warming periods. And so the question, and then after that one, you saw a pretty good decline, right? So it seemed to be going down quite a bit to around 200. What's this pattern? And what's this green line right here? Yeah. So this period, you did see there also was another, when was the last major Pleistocene glaciation? When all of Canada was covered, much of Wisconsin, Michigan, New York. That was about 12 to 15,000 years ago was the last major glacial ice age, okay? And then now we're in a warming period, okay? So obviously, I think these higher levels are associated with warming periods, okay? But what you'll notice here's a green line, right? And this is what we're seeing. Here's kind of taking that green line in terms of CO2 concentration from there over to here. And what do you see? It seems to be pretty flat from around 1,000 to about this period. And what's that peak associated with in the Industrial Revolution? And presumably the increased use of fuels and things like that and the release of carbon dioxide, okay? And here the value is at 2,000. Do you know what this value is now? And they measure this do you know where they measure these CO2 levels? Pretty much, yeah, they do it in oceans, but they do it primarily in high elevation observatories in Peru, Hawaii. I can't remember where all the other places where they get their best readings of atmospheric CO2, levels of CO2. And now, last year, it is now gone over 400. It's about 404. Okay. So here's the pattern, okay? And each one of these that represents kind of the variability from year to year, location and location, right? Some parts of the atmosphere might have, slightly higher CO2 at any one time. And the key here is that even though each of the red lines kind of represents the variability within year, probably among the sites where they're measuring carbon dioxide. It could be in the ocean, it could be in a high-level observatory in Peru or somewhere else, right? There's variability among sites. What's the take-home message from this, though? Do you think, is there a consistent trend in CO2 levels? I would say yes. And in 2000 and now, it's still going up in this direction. It's over 400. Okay. So there's another way to look at this at a much finer scale. And again, I'm not going to go into all the details of how the temperature anomaly was done, but this is pretty much the start of the Industrial Revolution. Various sources of carbon dioxide emissions, primarily from coal, but eventually fossil fuels and all sorts of things, right? And what you can see, there's a lot of variability, right? You can see it, there's a lot of noise in CO2 levels. And it varies a lot over years, but this is the one way to look at this, right? And it's like, when you always hear, oh, it got really cold this year, right? And what's an argument often used? Because it's really cold, is global warming real, right? I would suggest to you, you might want to think about that differently, right? You can always have sort of extreme events, right? And, things that happen, but the question is what we're really looking at are sort of long-term trends, right? And how you measure those things, it shouldn't be just, one unusual year, but are we seeing these consistent trends over many years? And again, all climate scientists would agree, there's a lot of variability in temperature anomalies, but in general, and especially what you're seeing, especially since 1960 and the 50s, is there's still some variability over the 5-year average. It goes up, then it went down slightly, but the consistent trend is in an upward direction in terms of increasing temperatures. Okay. And this is what I'd say 97% of climate scientists, they think this is strongly supportive of the role of increased greenhouse gases leading to global warming. Okay. Okay. So we'll spend a lot more time on kind of the details of carbon cycles and that sort of thing a little later in the class when we kind of get to biosphere level stuff, but I just wanted to introduce to you some of how we think about the arguments to suggest that, you know, global warming is real. Okay. And you can believe me or not. Okay. Just do well on the exam. Okay. So what we'll do now, we're going to talk about, so that's a little bit of kind of organismic ecology. We're going to spend a little time on what we call diet preference, okay? And we're going to try to make it fairly simple in terms of how do organisms make choices about the things that they eat, and what sort of variables influence what you should eat, right? And you can think about this. What do you guys like to eat? Energy food, right? And so the first thing we're going to talk about is the original models that suggested that what organisms do is they eat what's called the most profitable prey. And what it's focused on is the energy content, yield per unit time, right? So you just want to eat a lot of Cheetos and Doritos as quickly as you can, right, to get that energy boost. Okay. Well, we'll eventually suggest there might be other things you might want to think about. And again, you can listen to me or not. I don't care. I'm not here. But anyway, we're going to be focusing on energy content as the thing that's most important. And I'm not going to go through all of these. But what we're going to be developing is this concept called profitability. So again, we're looking at a predator. We're going to make it fairly simple. We're going to say a predator has a choice between, you know, a range of prey items. And we're going to focus, at least in the model and how it's originally developed, just on two different kinds of prey that they can eat. And what we're going to be determining is how profitable is each one of those prey items. And, you know, that's based on the energy content and what we call handling time. So it's the energy per unit time. And then we're also going to be, one of the things that, what do you think else might influence whether, you know, let's say you got a really profitable prey out in the environment, right, as a predator. What else do you think might influence whether that predator should specialize on it? What other feature of that prey do you think might influence specializing on it or not specializing on it? Huh? Yeah, teeth, but yeah, I heard it over there. Availability, right? So what's the density of the prey items? How quickly can you find them in your environment, right? And this is what we call the search time. So we'll be looking at kind of all three of those things. So we're not gonna go through all of the examples here, but we'll just go through this top one. These are kind of the classic ones that were talked about. So what's this thing here? That's a crab. And it is, the question is, they gave these crabs a series of mussels. So you guys don't eat many mussels, do you? Okay. Okay. So what they did is they gave this crab predator mussels of various lengths. So obviously these are small mussels, intermediate-sized mussels, and larger mussels. Okay? And what they have along here is this is what's called energy gain, and we'll just call that profitability. So all this is how many calories, you know, how much energy content is in a mussel of about 7 millimeters of length, right? And what's that? Where's that energy content in a mussel? It's inside the shell, right? It's like an oyster, right? It's the soft body parts that's enclosed by a shell, right? Okay. Obviously, what does a crab have to do to get to those parts? It has to break open that shell, pry apart those two shells, and to get to the soft parts. So there's going to be some period that it has to handle it before it can get to the soft tissues, okay? So what profitability is what's called energy gain. So it's the amount of energy gain per, you know, handling time. And it's usually like calories per second, okay? So here is sort of the, this is the energy gain curve, and here are the number of mussels eaten. Okay, this is what we call the profitability curve, okay? What's the most profitable size mussel? So these aren't different species of prey, it's just different sized individuals of the same prey. What's the most profitable prey? About right there, right? So really around the sort of the intermediate sized mussels, okay? These here, the smaller mussels, right, have a low profitability or a low energy content per unit time, and the big ones too, okay? Here's what this is the number of mussels that they ate by these size classes. Does it look like it fit the data? The expectation if they're eating the most profitable ones? That's kind of good, okay? They ate mostly these that were slightly less than 20 millimeters in length and, you know, slightly less of these, but in general, they kind of ate most of that's the ones they ate most of. Okay. So why do you think, why are the extremes the least profitable? What do you think it is? Okay. Okay. So they, say that again, they waste more energy trying to open it up. Do you think that's true for both of them or just one of them? Yeah. So what do you think? You guys, right. So the key here is which shells do you think are the easiest to get apart and get access to the soft tissues? The smaller ones. The problem is, guess what's inside? Not a whole lot. Not a whole lot of soft tissue and energy and that sort of thing. So probably the problem here, these don't require a lot of handling time. You know, crab gets it, and you'll be doing this in class. You'll be measuring the handling time of 3 different prey items, right? Hopefully, if lizards eat them, or we'll give you data. Okay. So some prey items take longer to handle than others, right? So these probably have the least amount of handling time. Which ones have the most handling time? The big ones. And what do you think, in general, as mussels get bigger, what do you think what happens to them? Often their shells get thicker, they get harder. They may sometimes spend a lot more allocation to like shell material and hardness than they do soft tissues. So it turns out, what do you think? You think these crabs have a hard time breaking these and getting access to them? Yeah. So they actually spend a lot of time, if they even try, handling them, and then guess what they do? They give up, okay? So a lot of this profitability, in terms of this energy gain, is a function of sort of the prey defenses and all those sorts of things, okay? So keep this in mind. Write this down, because you're going to be doing a little group problem. So in the early 70s, Krebs was a British ornithologist at Oxford, and he was interested in foraging and how organisms make choices about things to eat. And he developed the readings on Moodle have a much more sophisticated model, and I've condensed it into, I think, a simple model, okay? So I don't worry too much about that derivation of that optimal foraging model in the reading. Don't worry about this. So Krebs developed what's called an optimal foraging model, and he was the first one to demonstrate it experimentally, and I'm going to show you that result. So there are 3 components, so we've kind of talked about that. We're going to imagine there are 2 prey items that a predator has access to. We can measure the energy content of both of those prey items. We can measure the average handling time of each one of those prey items. And the other thing is what's called the encounter rate or search time. This is often the most difficult thing to measure, especially in the wild. But often you can get measures of density of prey items, and you can anticipate, you know, if a prey item's really rare, it's hidden, it's hard to see, the search time or the encounter rate of that thing is going to be really long. It's going to be a really high value, okay? So this is one of the harder things to measure in nature, and Krebs did it experimentally, and he changed the search times experimentally, and we'll show you the example of that. So those are the things we want to measure, is the energy content of each prey item, how long on average it takes to handle, and usually that means once it grabs a prey item and it has it fully ingested. That's how you measure handling time. So once a predator has got it, either in its talons or in its feet or in its mouth, and then when it fully ingests the prey item, that's the handling time. And then some measure of the encounter rate. So what we're saying, the first thing you want to do is you have 2 prey types. You want to determine if one is more profitable than the other. And all you do, the profitability is you just take the energy content of prey item 1, divide it by the handling time, and take the energy content of prey 2 and its handling time. It's just that ratio is the profitability. If this prey item has a higher value, that's the more profitable one. Okay, so the first step is just to do that quotient, that ratio. This is where I've condensed the model. The optimal foraging model basically says you should specialize on that most profitable prey only if this inequality is satisfied. So it's pretty much the same as here, up here, right? But what have we added? The search time of the most profitable prey. And I'm not going into why we don't include the search time of the less profitable prey, but the model basically eliminates S2, and all that matters is E1 divided by the sum of those two. If that value is greater than that, and again, this is the most profitable prey, then the model predicts you would only eat prey 1. Okay? So what I'm going to do, I'm going to show you the experiment that actually demonstrated this for the first time, and then you want me to give you a problem? And then bonus points? So you all have this written down, right? Okay. Okay. I could keep it up, but okay. So he did this with this bird. They're a very common insectivorous bird in the forests in England. They're related to chickadees. They're called great tits. They're very common in all throughout England and various parts of Northern Europe. Okay. So this is a really complicated graph. I'm just going to focus in on 2 parts of it. Okay. He did this experiment. He had these birds, and what he fed them were little worms. Okay? And what he did is he trained these things in the lab, and he put these worms on a conveyor belt. So he put the worms on a conveyor belt, and then he enclosed the conveyor belt except for one spot that was open. And guess who visited that opening spot waiting for a worm to come by? The birds. So he trained them for a while, got them used to, here's where my food's going to be. Okay? So he set up this experiment, did it with a bunch of birds. He had to train them for a while, and then eventually what he did is he gave them 2 kinds of prey items. He gave them on the conveyor belt, he put a series of large prey and small prey, okay, on the conveyor belt. And then he said, after an hour period, how many of the large prey and the small prey did they eat, right? And he was looking to see under what conditions could he get them. Which one do you think is the most profitable prey? The large prey, because it turns out these are just things that don't take a whole lot of handling time. They're pretty soft. The energy content and the handling times are pretty much the same. Once a bird gets it in its mouth, it's in. So the large prey, the large worms, were the most profitable prey. Okay. Well, all I want to focus on is this part, and primarily, let's just do this one. Okay. Here it's at low density. So what he's saying is they're on the wheel, how many large prey and small prey were on there? If there were 10 worms on the tray, on the rotating belt, how many were large and how many were small? Equal numbers, right? So the proportion encountered, there were basically 50% large prey and 50% small prey. The predicted proportion in diet comes from the optimal foraging model that I just showed you. And what does the model predict? That you should specialize or eat both? Yep, so here the prediction, and I'll tell you how he got to this and how he manipulated it. This experiment predicted they should not specialize, they should eat both the small and large prey. The way he did it is, guess what he manipulated here? We have the energy content and the handling time. There's one other variable. What do you think he manipulated? Yeah, the speed of the belt is exactly what he did. Guess what he did with this one? Slowed it way, way down. So the encounter rate of the most profitable prey, that S1, was a really, really long time. So what he created was where E1 divided by H1 plus S1 was not greater than the profitability of the small prey, because the search time and the encounter rate, search time was so long because the belt was moving so slowly. And so he predicted under this where the search time was so long or the encounter rate was, took so long, you would expect both. And here's the observed proportion in the diet. This was the actual experimental result. Look pretty good? Yeah. So the birds ate both prey items under those conditions where the most profitable prey was encountered at a very low rate. Okay? What about here? What do you think he did here? Same thing, right? Proportion encountered are the same. That's why I'm just focusing in on these two. He predicted they should just eat the large prey. He sped up this is where he sped it up, where the inequality under the optimal foraging model, the left is greater than the right. So they were encountering the profitable prey at a pretty high rate. How's it look? Perfect or not? Pretty close, not bad. He would have liked to have seen none of those, but occasionally, you make mistakes, okay? Or great tits make mistakes. Okay, so this basically, right here, I'm sorry. So in general, they ate about 90% of the most profitable prey, but on occasion it didn't fit the model exactly right, and I'm not going to go into all the details of why that is, but it's probably hard to get, they may have just, as it's moving across that conveyor belt, right, they may not have been able to discriminate, oh, that's a large versus a small prey, they just started eating. Okay, but in general, they did show a pretty good preference for the most profitable prey. Okay. Okay, and what we'll do at the end of this, you'll turn it in for extra credit, but at the end, we'll do a clicker question, and I'll say answer. So that's how we'll do attendance. Okay, here's and you can work in groups. This is actually a study that was done. Seagulls, this was on the Pacific coast of Oregon, encounter mussels. You know what sea urchins are? Sea urchins are great, but what do they have a lot of? Spines, right? Okay? And so there are various things you have to do as a predator to get access to them, and they do like them, but anyway. So gulls encounter two prey with the following energy content, handling time, and search times. So the first thing is tell me which is the most profitable prey, and then apply the formula and tell me, should they eat the most profitable prey? Is it mussels or sea urchins? So see what you get. Okay. So first thing, determine most profitable, which of these two is more profitable, and then set up the inequality. Okay. This will be a bonus point. Okay, this shouldn't take long, should it?
No, it's done.
Okay. So somebody texted me Sunday and said, why weren't you at International Night? And then I realized I had 2 tickets and completely, I know, and I completely spaced it out. That's what I heard. I heard it was nice. Yeah, I apologize. I'm really sorry. So, yeah. Yeah, and the provost was there too, right? So, yeah. Okay, everybody done? Ugh, hot. Hot in here?
They're talking about eating mussels and clams and like I would these are like cooked. They're like put over a plate when you're like all the
I should figure out a way to do this on the web so you don't have to waste paper. Whoa, I got it. Okay, so if you think, choose A if you think they should eat mussels only, specialize, or B if they should eat both. A if they should specialize on mussels, or B they should eat both. And you have the answers here, so I'm just using this for attendance. So you can choose whatever answer you want. I shouldn't say that. Okay. Everybody in? I'll leave it up just in case. What's the answer? What should they do? What's the most profitable prey? By far, right? Okay. And is the inequality satisfied? Yes. How do you do that? Huh. Oh, there it is. So first thing, determine what was most profitable. Mussels, 20 divided by 20 is 1. Urchins, not a lot of stuff to eat, although it's really good once you get to it, right? It's a delicacy, right? But it takes a lot of handling time, okay? And then obviously it's easily satisfied. 20 divided by 30 is much greater than 5 over 30, so they would definitely only eat mussels, okay? Has everybody done the attendance? Okay, I'll stop. Very good. Okay. Okay. I won't ask who that one person is. Okay. I'm going to do one more slide, and this is one of my favorite things in the world to talk about. So energy is important. Is energy the only thing that matters? Do you have other things that you need in your diet? Yeah, you need more than energy, right, to have a healthy diet. Okay. So there are a lot of essential nutrients, right, that often are in foods and things we eat, oftentimes not in the foods we eat, right? But there are lots of, when the optimal foraging model was developed, right, and the focus was on energy and profitability, people very quickly said, well, there's a lot more to that than just energy. And this is especially true in herbivores. And this is one of the classic studies that we consider constraints on this idea that all that matters is maximizing the amount of energy you take in per unit time. And this is a study done on moose in Isle Royale, which is an island out in the middle of Lake Superior where there are moose, and there actually are native wolf populations too that were introduced there. And there's a really interesting long-term study of wolf-moose dynamics, but this is primarily focused on the diet of moose. And the observation that the researcher made was he noticed weird things about moose. On a daily basis, they'd spend a lot of time up in the forests, right? Nibbling on, leaves of trees, shrubs, understory plants, And then on a very predictable basis, they'd go down into sort of the aquatic, the marshes, the fringes of the lake, and things where there are a lot of aquatic grasses. And they were spending a lot of time eating there. And if you've ever tried to eat an aquatic plant living in fresh water, they're often, do it sometime. They're kind of not really easy to eat. They're very fibrous, they're hard to digest and all this. So he was like, why are they doing this, right? Because when you think about leaf tissue from just birch trees, beech, these other things, and understory, they're easy to digest, they have a lot of energy, all these sorts of things. So he was kind of curious, why were they doing this on a regular basis? Well, it turns out when he started looking at these aquatic plants and these terrestrial plants, that these aquatic plants had a lot of sodium in them. These upland plants had very little sodium in them. So sodium is an essential nutrient for a lot of things, especially herbivores. So he did this study, and I'm not going to go into all the models and all the details, but how he got to this is extremely complicated. But what we're looking at here is the sort of the dry weight of the aquatic plants. Just think of this as the amount of aquatic plant material they would need to eat. Here's the amount of the terrestrial plants of the beech, the maple, the understory trees where they were foraging, and then they'd go down and eat these aquatic plants. Okay, let's deal with this one first. You'll see lines here. There are 3 different lines. So let's deal with this first line. This is what's called the sodium requirement line. Each one of these lines, and how he got this is another matter, but each one of these lines is kind of, think of it as if you're below this line for the sodium requirement, if you're below, say, 760, you don't meet your minimum daily sodium requirement. So that's bad, right? If you are above that line, you meet your daily sodium requirement. And how he got this is another matter, okay? So as you look at this line, this is the line that only goes straight across. What do you think that means? Where can they get their sodium from? Only one kind of plant, it's the aquatic plants. It turns out if you ate this much dry weight of terrestrial plants and you didn't eat any of these, you wouldn't meet your sodium requirement. So they clearly needed to eat these aquatic plants to meet their sodium requirement. That's why they were doing it. Okay. So here's the other one. This is what's called the energy curve or the energy maintenance requirement as a function of the two kinds of, and what you'll see here, it's a diagonal, right? It's not straight across, so it goes like this. So again, it's what's called an equilibrium line. So if you are above this line, what do you think that means in terms of meeting your daily energy requirements? You can meet them, okay? If you're below it, you're not meeting your daily energy requirement, okay? So let's go here. Let's say you wanted to eat, say you were a moose and you were up here. Say you ate 2,500 grams of aquatic plants and no terrestrial plants. Does that look good? Yep. You meet your daily energy requirement. Do you meet your sodium requirement? Okay. So you meet both of those things. There's another problem, though. And this is what's called the digestive limit curve, or line. Think of this as if you're above that line, your gut's going to bust open because you've eaten too much. If you're below it, you're okay. So that's one that's kind of a little different. So if you were a moose that ate all aquatic plants, you could meet your sodium requirement, you're above it, and you were up in here and you'd meet your energy requirement, what problem would you have? You actually can't eat enough of those aquatic plants because you're maxed out here in terms of your gut capacity, so you actually can't meet your energy requirement because you just have to eat too much, okay? Let's focus, this is the magic triangle. What is this? Why is that the magic triangle? That's what a moose should eat, okay? And in fact, this is the best. But if you're in this combination of terrestrial plants and aquatic plants, that's where you meet all those constraints. So let's look at this. Here's the digestive limit. If you eat this much dry weight terrestrial and dry weight aquatic, right, you're below your digestive limit, right? You're not busting your gut open. Are you above your sodium requirement? Okay, so you're above that line when you're in that triangle. Are you also above your energy requirement? Yep, okay. So that triangle right in there is where both the sodium requirement is met, the energy requirement is met, and sort of the gut size limit is met. You're not busting your gut open. Okay. Why is this the best as opposed to 2 and 1? That's a harder one. Well, what that is actually doing is you're not only meeting your energy requirement and you're kind of at your digestive limit, but you're also getting probably the maximum amount of energy too. So that's kind of the best point. So what he said is, and this is the key point, is he said the optimal diet for a moose in this island should be this amount of dry weight terrestrial plants and this amount of aquatic plants. And it turns out that's about 70% of their diet should be comprised of the forest plants and about 30% of the aquatic plants. And it turns out when he actually went in and measured how much they ate, how much time they spent on each environment, guess what? It was about exactly, they spent about 70% of their time in the forest, about 30% of their in the aquatic environments, and the amount that they ingested was almost 70% terrestrial plants and 30% aquatic plants. So it was considered, and this was a very sophisticated model that was developed, but the outcome was it actually fit the observations of them in nature, what they kind of ate, and met all of these sort of things. Okay. That's enough of me lecturing. So the last thing we'll talk about maybe next time is obviously getting nutrients is important. The other thing is you don't want to be eaten either, right? So a lot of times that creates some problems. Okay. So let me stop this and I'll hand back. Let me talk about just the exams real